Good morning. If you'll turn to Ephesians chapter 2, that's where we'll be this morning. Ephesians chapter 2. In verse 16 of Ephesians 2, he says that Jesus might reconcile them both in one body to God through the cross, and by it having put to death the enmity. Here Paul makes a very bold claim that Jesus put to death the centuries-long hostility between us and God, but actually the main focus of this passage is on the hostility between Jews and Gentiles. In Jesus' day, there was massive hostility between these two groups. One writer put it this way: the Gentiles, said the Jews, were created by God to be fuel for the fires of hell. God, they said, loves only Israel of all the nations he had made. A good snake you would crush, they said, and the best of the Gentiles you would kill. It was not even lawful to render help to a Gentile mother in the hour of her sorest need, for that would simply be to bring another Gentile into the world. If a Jewish boy married a Gentile girl, or a Jewish girl married a Gentile boy, the funeral of that Jewish boy or girl was carried out. If you'll recall from our recent studies in Acts, Jews wouldn't even eat with the Gentiles, and Peter had a lot of explaining to do. When he came to Jerusalem, they found out that he visited the household of Cornelius. Even necessarily because he ate with him, but just visiting, just going to his house. He had a lot of explaining to do for that. There was also a barricade in the temple complex, beyond which the Gentiles could not pass. And they had writings, signs carved on stones saying that if the Gentiles go beyond this wall, this barricade, then they were to be put to death. You recall, that's actually how Paul's trials started in the first place. That's why he's in prison for 4 whole years, because he was accused of bringing a Gentile across that barrier. Well, how did all this happen? It happened really as a result of the misuse of the law of Moses. In a couple ways. Number one, the law of Moses became a source of national pride for the Jews. When God gave the Israelites the law, it called them to a holy life, a life different from the Gentile nations around them. So you have verses like Leviticus 18, 24, and 26, where it says, "Do not defile yourselves by any of these things, for by all these the Gentiles which I am casting out before you have become defiled. You shall not do any of these abominations." So you can see how over time the Jews would look at the Gentiles and associate them with moral abominations. And that over time that would lead them to pride, to feeling morally superior to the Gentiles. Because we are holy and you are not. We are better than you because we have the law and you do not. Secondly, breaking the law of Moses allowed Gentiles to dominate them. You remember, at the end of the law of Moses, God gave these stipulations, these conditions. And he said, look, if you disobey me, I'm going to raise up a Gentile nation, and they're going to come and conquer you and enslave you. You see, their sin, their violation of the law of Moses, brought hostility between them and God. And God said, because of that, I'm going to raise up foreign nations to come and dominate you. And this is exactly what happened all throughout the Judges period, on and off. For a period of 330 years, you have these foreign nations coming and oppressing the Jews. And then later, the Assyrians destroyed Israel. And then Babylon came in and destroyed Judah and the temple and hauled them off into captivity for 70 years. Even in the 400 years of silence, the Greeks ruled over the Jews, tried to force them to adopt Greek culture. And by the time of Jesus' day, the Romans are in charge. So you can see how over time, the Jews would really come to resent on a deep level these Gentiles, because we're supposed to be the rulers. We're supposed to be dominating the Gentiles, not the other way around. But here's the irony they didn't seem to understand. The Jews thought they were morally superior to the Gentiles. But the reason God allowed the Gentiles to rule over them is because the Jews were living just like the Gentiles. They were committing the same abominable sins as the Gentiles were. They violated God's law and were just as separated from God as the Gentiles were. And so God put the Gentiles in power over them to perhaps put the Jews in their place until their truly morally superior Messiah King would come and show them how to rule, would come and cleanse their souls. So now we're in Ephesians 2 again. Let's go to verse 11 and 12. Therefore remember that formerly you, the Gentiles in the flesh, who were called uncircumcision by the so-called circumcision, which is performed in the flesh by human hands. Remember that you were at that time separate from Christ, excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. When it says that the Jews referred to the Gentiles as uncircumcision, that was derogatory. It's kind of like David, when he looks at Goliath and he says, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine to defy the armies of the living God?" Or like Samson's parents, who were just so frustrated and exasperated. They said, "Can't he find a woman from his own people? Why does he have to go to these uncircumcised Philistines?" So there's this great hostility between Jews and Gentiles. And even worse, when it comes to the blessings of God's covenant, the Gentiles were excluded. It didn't mean that no Gentile could ever, come to serve the one true God. Rahab did that with her family. Other Gentiles over the years have done that. But generally, that didn't happen very often. The Gentiles were serving false gods. So they had no hope. They had no participation in the blessings of the one true God. Verse 13 says, "But now in Christ Jesus, you who formerly were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ." Interestingly, the language being used here is drawn from the Old Testament, which applied to Jews. So the Jews, because of their sins, would be far off from God, and so God gave them the priesthood to offer animal sacrifices so that the Jews, who were far off because of their sins, could be brought near, can draw near to God through those sacrifices. And now he's using that same language and applying it to the Gentiles. That the Gentiles, who were far off from God because of their sins, God provided the ultimate lamb, the ultimate sacrifice, to cleanse them of their sins and allow them to draw near as well. Now watch how Jesus deals with the hostility. Verses 14 and 15. "He himself is our peace, who made both groups into one and broke down the barrier of the dividing wall by abolishing in his flesh the enmity, which is the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so that in himself he might make the two into one new man, thus establishing peace." When they heard the phrase barrier of the dividing wall, probably the literal image that came to their mind was that barrier in the temple complex to keep Gentiles out. But the barrier Jesus is talking about here isn't that physical barricade in the temple complex. It's actually the law of Moses, which is kind of an odd thing when you think about it, because the law of Moses was a wonderful gift from God to his people. Paul in Romans 7 calls the law holy and righteous and good. And it almost sounds contradictory to what Jesus said on the Sermon on the Mount when he said, "I didn't come to abolish the law, I came to fulfill it." Well, now it's saying he's abolishing the law in his flesh. So what in the world is going on here? What we're going to see in our Bible class this morning in Ephesians is that Paul sees behind the curtain of this world. And he knows that as individuals and as groups, we are constantly influenced by the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. They are the powers, authorities, and rulers of this age that try to divide us and cause hostility between us and enslave humanity to sin. That's what happened in the garden. In the very beginning, you had this peace between Adam and Eve, and then Satan comes in, and he influences Eve, and they sin, and now Adam says, "This wife that you gave me, it's her fault." And there's hostility and divide. And ultimately, their sin caused hostility between them and God as well, and they were cast from his presence. Well, likewise, we won't go through this, but in Romans 7, Paul personified the powers of this age as sin. And he said that the law of Moses was great, and it told me not to covet. But sin took opportunity through that law and deceived me and used it to produce covetousness in me. The powers of this age used the forbidden to arouse my curiosity, and I coveted and I died. The law of Moses was meant to be good and righteous. But because the Jews gave in to the temptation to break the law, to misuse the law became a source of death and hostility between them and between the God who gave it to them, and between them and the Gentiles. You see, the evil powers of this age tempted the Jews to twist the law and use it as a source of national pride and moral superiority over the Gentiles. And not just moral superiority, but even superiority of worth and value as individuals. God wanted them to use the law to become a light to the Gentile nations, to show the whole earth the glory of a community that rules in God's image and lives with His character. In fact, the whole reason God chose Israel was to be the vehicle through which the blessing would come to all the Gentiles of the world. That was the promise to Abraham. But instead, under the influence of Satan, they twisted the law, used it as a cause of division and hostility with the other nations, which was only made worse when they broke the law and God sent the Gentiles to dominate them. So when it says Jesus abolished the law in His flesh, it doesn't mean that the law of Moses just, went away completely and there's no value at all in God's law. No, it means the law was no longer the defining mark of God's people, so that the powers of this age could no longer influence them to use it as a source of national pride. It also meant that the powers of this age could no longer use the guilt of sin from the law to keep the hostility between us and God. We could actually be forgiven of our violations of that law. On the cross, Jesus put hostility to death. The hostility of sin that created the enmity between us and God, and a misuse of the law that caused hostility between the Jews and the Gentiles. Look in verses 17 and 18. He came and preached peace to you who were far away, and peace to those who were near. For through Him we both have our access in one Spirit to the Father. He quotes from Isaiah 57 there, which is this great message of hope that one day all these people who are far away from God would actually be brought near in relationship to Him. And what is awesome about that is when you go back and read Isaiah 57, just like 3 verses earlier, God says this, "It will be said, build up, prepare the way, remove every obstacle out of the way of my people." What an awesome prophecy that was. Because God knew in order to build up, in order to actually build my people, I have to remove the obstacles that keeps that from happening. He knew He had to put hostility to death. And the law of Moses was a huge obstacle. By removing the law of Moses as the requirement for being right with God, He took that huge obstacle out of the way. And in the verses to follow, which we'll cover in Bible class this morning in Ephesians 2, the very next thing he talks about is now he can build his new temple using the living stones of the Jews and the Gentiles. Now, let me add one more element here to what Jesus did. As you ponder the question, what is the best way to end hostility? There are a lot of answers that make hostility worse, like insults or retaliation or violence. Those things just add fuel to the fires of hostility. But really, the best way to end hostility is to take away every reason your opponents have to be hostile against you and give them every reason to love you instead. When Jesus died on the cross, He bore the hostility of the Jews under the leadership of Caiaphas and the high priest and the Sanhedrin council and even King Herod. And he bore the hostility of the Gentiles under the leadership and governorship of Pilate and those Roman soldiers. And I think there's a foreshadowing of the end of the hostility between Jews and Gentiles in Luke 23, verse 12, when it says, Herod and Pilate became friends that very day, for before this they had been enemies. Jews and Gentiles, Herod and Pilate, became friends that day. Jesus took the hostility between the Jews and the Gentiles and gave them an opportunity to work together and channel that hostility onto himself instead. And Jesus did not retaliate. He did not insult. He did not get violent. He showed them how to handle the hostility of our enemies. That is to love them in return, to overcome evil with good. Jesus put hostility to death, number one, by removing the law of Moses as the defining mark of God's people, so it can't be used as a source of national pride, and it can't be used to condemn us of sin anymore. And secondly, by taking all of the hostility in the world upon himself, and by showing us love is the better way. What this shows us, brethren, is that hostility has no place in Jesus' church. And so as we partake of the Lord's Supper this morning, we need to ask ourselves, is there any hostility between me and my brethren? Have I erected new walls and new barriers, new dividing lines that Jesus died to tear down? Am I loving my enemies, or am I just doing things to make hostility worse through insults or retaliation or giving the cold shoulder? Jesus says, if you recognize your brother has something against you, don't even worship me before you go and be reconciled, putting the hostility to death. So this morning, as we partake of the Lord's Supper, let's praise God that Jesus put the hostility to death between us and God, and between us and our fellow human beings. And let's determine to end all hostility in our own lives and make peace with our enemies the way Jesus made peace with us.